They're brought to you by the Friends of the Library. Yes, the Friends of the Library. If you love old books for cheap, please visit their bookstore. Thank you.
So, some of us are addicted to still reading newspapers, and this is today's Los Angeles Times, and on the second page is a story called "Spending Soars to Sell Drugs. Industry has paid lavishly to influence doctors and patients. For diabetes, the cost of medication has gone up by $725 million nationwide per year. Pain control, $542 million. This is the cost of advertising. Cancer, $274 million. Respiratory diseases, $255 million. Infectious diseases, $217 million. Depression, $193 million. Allergies has decreased by $35 million. Menopause has increased by $106 million. And contraception has increased by $119 million. Those are the budgets for advertising for the major drug companies of the United States. The first paragraph reads, drug makers and other healthcare companies spent over $30 billion in a single year to influence the medical choices made by Americans and steer them toward treatments that were newer, more expensive, and sometimes riskier than their tried and true alternatives, according to the research. So yes, please.
I'd like to know what's your
We have an
opinion.
eager.
I'd like to know what's your opinion about the fact that the American public, through the government, is subsidizing pharmacies.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
So most of us in the room, with maybe one or two exceptions, are referred to as mature adults. And for those of us who are a little nerdy and were exposed to a book by a man named Vance Packard in the 1960s called The Hidden Persuaders. When that book came out, for many of us, it was shocking. You mean to say that there are people in the advertising industry who spend time looking at the psychology of human beings, in particular the behaviors that we have, and the way we make choices? Are they data-driven, or are they the voice of the newscaster driven, or are they color-driven, or the color of the images? What moves us to make a decision of some type that is monetized and that someone is selling something? And for those of us who own television sets, which means everyone in the room probably, it is clear that there is a hefty dose of advertising on cable, and well, not on Netflix or those kinds of things, but on, the others. And definitely the networks exist based on that. And if you're watching a news program, whether it's talking heads or a narrative, it's mixed with whether it's the weather, whether it's an update on sports. They just slip in by a Chevrolet or a Toyota or a Prius or whatever it is. So we understand Vance Packard, Hidden Persuaders, and we understand from real life experience that advertising is part of the American way of life. It's like we are a consumer-driven nation. Our economy, measured in gross domestic product, so-called GDP, is a reflection of the economics collectively of our country. And our economy arguably is 72 or 73% of the American economy is based on shopping. Whether it's online or offline, shopping is absolutely essential to make the engine of the United States turn. Whether it's grandiose shopping, the other day there's kind of a new SUV by Rolls-Royce, yeah, that's it, Rolls-Royce, that has a base price of $300,000, and then with the bells and whistles, it gets to be about $400,000 for an automobile. And there's a waiting list for people who are buying this. So it's hard to justify, of course, but it kind of goes with the word freedom and freedom of choice. So with that in mind, I thought it would be worthwhile to indulge you a little bit. It won't hurt, but a little bit, to explore the human brain. Because that's kind of the center of each of us. Whether we have a sore hand, or our elbows are a little creaky, or whatever the hell happens to be the pain of the day, and as we get older we understand there's very often a pain of the day, and my wife has taught me sort of there's a 2-week kind of thing. If it doesn't go away in 2 weeks, see a doctor kind of thing, but very often a day or two, and we move on to another pain of some type. All of that is in our heads. The brain it's just the most remarkable organ of any organ in any creature that has ever existed, whether it's a virus, a bacteria, a plant, other mammals, and then eventually human beings. The brain is the most complicated. If I could get my hands on one for this morning, which I kind of deliberately didn't even try to do, the human brain would fit into the 2 palms of my hand. It would weigh 3 pounds. It would be 80% water. 3 pounds, 80% water. If I could happen to have microscopic vision and I really looked at it, there are 86 billion neurons and 86 billion glial cells. 2 kinds of cells. Neurons, 86 billion, glial cells, 86 billion. And now if I could sort of wipe my eyes a little bit and even look closer, there are trillions, not millions, trillions of synapses. And that's the business of the brain. It does remarkable things, and I can only speak for my own brain. Your brain might be just a tad different. My brain is investing 85% of its effort and activity on things I am unconscious of. I know nothing about. It's holding my 2 hands together. It's allowing me to make eye contact. Although my personal cognitive is kicking in, I'm deciding to make eye contact whether it is or not. All of my metabolism, all of my when I need to go to the bathroom, all of those kinds of things are involuntary, and we call that collectively the subconscious. Leaving 15 to 20% is what we control. It's humbling, but it's true. So my decision to buy a Rolls-Royce or a VW is under my conscious activity. And how does that work? I believe that the head is really the most gorgeous part of the human body. Gorgeous not in the sense of beauty, but gorgeous in the sense of this is where the entire sensory gadgets are kept. I see through this. I hear through this. I smell through this. I taste through this. I can touch through this. I mean, it's amazing. So I'm looking around, and as I'm making a visual, some stuff is coming through the air, going into cells that are extremely sensitive to the images. It's going into my vision process, running down the optic nerve to the back of my head. And since I have two eyes, I've got this peripheral vision. It's going back to the occipital part of the brain. Then it's getting bounced around, connected to, when I was on a trip in 1987, I saw a woman that just looks like you, and I wondered, could it be the same person? And all of a sudden, it's going crazy. So I mean, think of that. This is biology. I mean, it's not a machine. This is biology. You don't plug it into the wall. You just feed it. Oh, by the way, the brain requires 20% of your diet. And in particular, if you don't take in water, one of the parts of the body that is really sensitive to that is the brain. Dehydration leads to misfiring of what's going on between our ears, so to speak. So the human brain only works by information that comes into it, parenthesis, not true. We have reflection. You can sit on your couch at home, or chair, and just kind of like be thinking, and all of a sudden thinking is, I should have called her, or I should have called him, or I forgot to do this. I mean, there could be all of that kind of stuff, a lot of I shoulds and didn't do stuff. Or it can be pastoral. I'm listening to some music and I've got a vision of either something I experienced, or it was in a film, or it was in a magazine, or it was in a museum, or something like that. The brain can pull up stuff that we can reflect upon, and it's connected to meditation, Zen activities, and Buddhist activities, and many formal religions. Judaism and Christianity and Islam are connected with acts of prayer that conjure up the image of who passed. It could be, in the case of my wife and I, a couple of weeks ago, we lost a dog that we loved dearly and had been in our lives for 14 years. And it doesn't seem to take much for either one of us to feel her, see her, smell her, experience her as if she were still with us. It's only been 2 weeks, and 2 weeks maybe in terms of mourning and grieving and so forth, whether it's a human being or, you know, these pets that are in our lives become actually supersede many human beings in our life. So all of that kind of goes together. With all of that in mind, I hope I've grabbed your attention, and basically to explore the brain as you've never done before. To kind of look at it as this amazing thing and kind of take it apart and get a sense of it. And those of us who have children and grandchildren, there's some things that will help explain some of their behaviors as they slide through the banister of life, so to speak. So through the good graces of the Friends of the Library,
Yes, the friends of the library.
we have been blessed with a new toy which allows us to do this kind of thing. So one of my fears is called Alzheimer's. My mother had Alzheimer's. I was a caregiver. Lois and I spent many years in that position, and as the years went by, our relationship changed to being strangers rather than a son and so forth. It lasted almost a decade, but when you think of the United States from an economic point of view, $1.5 trillion, or 9.8% of the gross domestic product, is spent on the care of neurodegenerative diseases. That's Parkinson's, garden variety dementia, Alzheimer's, and then of course some that are rarer and in a sense cause less fear that come along the way. So the neurodegenerative diseases, it's an organ. It could be like a heart. So hearts have heart attacks, and hearts have various cardiovascular issues. The brain has its own issues. Stroke, cerebral vascular incidence, stroke is another example. But the cost is unbelievable. And therefore, if we can't prevent it or learn how to deal with it better, those costs obviously continue to increase as our country increases, and through the wonders of healthcare, as it is, the human lifespan, it's a generality, has doubled from 1900 to the present. It went from 47, roughly, I'm rounding off the edges of these numbers, it went from 47 years of age, was life expectancy in 1900 for the larger public, to currently 78% for the larger public. The 78% means if you go to Compton, life expectancy is 50 years of age. And if you go to San Marino, it might be 82 or 83 years of age. But when you put it all together, the average life expectancy for the United States currently is 78. Now, we are the best, most wonderful country in the world. Our healthcare has got to be the finest in the world. Well, maybe for some, but when you take the aggregate number and you put it on a scale with the other countries in the world, life expectancy ranks 16th in the world. And there's a whole bunch of countries that spend less money on healthcare, more money on education and safety nets to reduce depression, to reduce anxiety, to reduce a number of the issues that characterize a modern, sophisticated American, such as myself. So it's extremely important that something is missing in the American book of tricks, in which we are producing a population of aging people, as is all of the industrial countries of the world, but our aging itself is less than 16 other countries in the world, and how we age, the amount of Alzheimer's and dementia, is not a pretty picture. And so the idea of coming to grips with life and all of the beautiful things about being alive and well and stimulated and engaged and learning, good stuff, good stuff. But we also understand that everything that lives must die, and therefore one of the things for us to think about is death, with grace and character and style. And most of us, Lois and I in particular in this room, would agree that the ideal is maybe to live into your mid-90s and die in your sleep. And if you're coupled, to die together in your sleep. The idea of being a survivor is not necessarily a first choice for a lot of people. So, with that in mind, this brain of ours, connected with human aging, is also connected with proteins and genes and something called epigenetics, which we'll explore. And inflammation. The brain gets inflamed like skin gets inflamed, and livers and other parts of the body, and it has a way of dealing with it, but if it's not dealing with it successfully, we have a problem. And then the metabolism. If we don't take in a balanced, reasonable, colorful diet that is not emphasizing red meat for the color, but rather green peppers and red peppers and kale and all of these kinds of things, then the brain is not going to be optimal until the lights go out. And so we've seen up close what it's like for people to get demented and slide into that space where they're alive, but they're not engaged with the outside world, which means their brains are not able to process the enormous stimulation of a voice, of an odor, of a view of one person or a collective of people. Extremely important. Our brains are absolutely dependent upon being stimulated. So when people say, you know, we always do this in June, we always do this in September, I always drive this way, I always park over here. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. The brain needs to be stimulated, and diverse experiences of whatever they are, food, smells, travel, no travel, books, whatever is in your life, your brain thrives on being stimulated, and it kind of, if it's not used, it's abused, and if both go together, bad things can happen. So the fact that you're here today, you voted with your feet, so to speak, that the idea of something a little different, some new ideas, a different perspective could be useful. And I'm going to give you some homework to do at the end so that between now and next week, you'll keep all of this going. This book is called The Brain, The Story of You by David Eagleman. He's a neurosurgeon. He's on the faculty of UC San Francisco, and he wrote this book, which is an excellent read on the human brain. If you open it up, this is the table of contents of the book. And you know, these classical questions, especially when we get a little bit older, we get kind of into the genealogy stuff. Where did I come from? And you know, Ancestry.com and the National Geographic and 23andMe and a number of these, there's a real palpable curiosity of where did I come from? Who am I? And then of course, where am I going? Those are independent of religion and gender and nationality and all of that kind of stuff. Those are universal, being a human being questions. Whether animals do that, we're not sure. Some stuff that my wife and I were reading last night with respect to the passing of our dog is dogs tend to live in the moment. They don't seem to sit around and wonder about yesterday, and they don't seem to be thinking about tomorrow. They are in the moment. Their love for you is in the moment. And one of the things each of us can learn from a pet, which is not always broadcast, is that reality. That we need to spend some real central nervous time on the moment. And not, I mean, I've sat in rooms like you are, and I'm sitting there saying, okay, I gotta get my card detailed, and I gotta pick up this, and I forgot a gift over here, and I'm meeting somebody over there, and you can fill your mind with this stuff, future tense, and completely miss the moment of what in the hell this person is saying, or why am I here, or what's going on. And we've all had those experiences. This is why in universities, the students almost always sit at the back of the room, because it's closer to the exit. In the case of, we have some overachievers here who are sitting here. So, and then the issue of what is reality. I have been taught, my background is sort of science-y, nerdy kind of thing. I have been taught that my reality, in part, is subject to the wavelengths that my vision can take in. I don't see infrared. But if I could see infrared, then my vision would be infrared plus what I currently am able to do. So the wavelengths in this room, the colors that you're wearing, have to be within the domain of my capacity for me to take it in. My hearing is also subject to boundary conditions. I can only hear things so low, I can only hear things so high, and then everything else is basically not audible to me. All of us have those conditions. We have evolved from simpler, different kind of creatures who have attributes for their niche in the life cycles that they experience. But reality is subjective, it is not objective. So when somebody says, I saw you shoot that woman, I saw you, or you know, the thing in the paper over the last couple of days, 4 relatively young African-American young men were accused of beating and raping a woman 70 some odd years ago. And it turns out they didn't do it. But they've spent, well, now 3 of them are dead, 1 is still alive, they spent 70 years in prison. So, again, eyewitness. You did this to me, and I'm in court, and I swear, and all of that kind of stuff. It's just not true. But to you, it's true. And the juries, you know, 70 some odd years ago, this took place in one of those southern small communities. It was an all-white jury, it was a white judge, it was the climate of excessive racism and all of this kind of stuff, and we haven't yet obviously escaped all of that, but some of us are working on it, and hopefully someday. But reality is subjective, eyewitness subjective, and you really need, academically, different lines of evidence to lead to the same conclusion. So in your own shopping and making behavioral decisions, if you've got one line of evidence giving you something and another line of evidence giving you something and maybe a third, this is why getting a second opinion is such an important piece of being a mature adult. Data looked at from another person's point of view, he or she making some recommendations. They may validate what you got from somebody else or not. If not, maybe a third opinion might be useful. But we need more than one line of evidence to say, aha, this is the relative truth or reality. And many students don't seem to grasp that concept and think that if she tells me something, okay, I'm immunized for the rest of my life against ignorance in whatever it is she shared with me. And that's where the polarization comes in of our politics. That's where some of the behaviors that we see around us come in, because there is a lack of critical thinking in our society, not just our society, many societies, which means a failure to optimize the human brain to be able to use its full capacity to guide behavior choices. That's the key. So here, how do I decide? Why do I need you? I've driven an hour with my wife this morning. I need you. I need to have this exercise of sharing what I'm thinking about with you and suggesting that what I'm thinking about might be useful to you. It's a wonderful act, and we've all, if you have grandchildren or children or close friends, the idea of giving thoughtful information and receiving it it's a high. You can get high on this stuff, and I would argue it beats some of the drugs out there. It's a good thing. And then, do we need to transform American healthcare, which is kind of embedded in this 6-week course? And the argument could be intuitively, this is the best, the United States is the best country in the world. The healthcare is the best in the world. The doctors are the best in the world. The doctor that I happen to go to is the very best in the world. My dentist, my dental hygienist, my physical therapist. I mean, there's this thing of really getting kind of really in there. Everybody's the best. Top of their class. How many top of the class people? I don't know, but there's a lot of top of the class. Well, then there is, well, what are the health, so that's one way for the brain to take in the information, swallow it, and that becomes the core belief system. And then some other line of evidence says, but look at the health outcomes. Infant mortality, infant morbidity, chronic diseases, lifespan, life expectancy, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, blah, blah, blah. Where are the numbers for us? And all of a sudden, we're 24th in the world, we're 19th in the world, we're 16th in the world. We are not objectively, by this comparison strategy, the best. Well, our economy is doing very well, unemployment is down, unless you look closer. And when you look closer, for example, employment, it's down to 2.5% or 3% at the moment. But the people who are employed are working 2 jobs without benefits. So the numbers are good, the unemployment, but the reality of that man or woman is very different than what is implied with the term full employment. Because these companies, Target and Walmart and all of those big box kind of companies, figure out when I hire you, what is the line in California that I can hire you that I don't have to pay benefits. Now at USC, health benefits are 34%. So when you hire somebody for, say, $100,000 a year salary, you need to have also another $34,000 to take care of benefits, and health benefits being the major ticket. Well, that's another line of evidence. So you pull these pieces together, and then you say, well, we're still a work in progress. We are trying. We don't have 100% health coverage. We've got 27 million people without health insurance. We're using a model that the other 9 industrial countries of the world don't use. They use single payer. We use multiple payers. We have a different model. We have different outcomes, and we have different costs. Our costs are double to triple of any industrial country in the world. The other thing to keep in mind is this brain of ours didn't start with us. We were not created like spontaneous generation where we just all of a sudden we appeared. We came out of vertebrate evolution. And during vertebrate evolution, that guy or gal on my far left, your right, had a different world, came into different influences, different diet, different oxygen in the atmosphere. A lot of things were different when amphibians sort of first appeared. And then as we go through evolution, the distribution of eyes and ears, and there's some subtle differences, but they're remarkably similar. If you look at evolution, especially the very top panel, notice that every embryo looks identical, that going from a fish to a crow library member. It's pretty amazing. They are like identical, which means that the basic blueprint for making a head, a neck, a chest, an abdomen, our limbs began a long time ago. The rules began a long time ago. So it's kind of autopilot from the time of fertilization as the egg is dividing into cells and we're going through some of the highlights of embryonic development. It really starts in the last trimester. We really start sorting out to look and be fish or to be human or to be primate, whatever we become. Now, meanwhile, if we just look at the brain doesn't like start over. We don't, sometimes in our homes, we go into a room and let's say we've lived in the home a long time and we walk into a room and kind of look around and say, this has got to go. This furniture has been around and everything looks old and cruddy and dilapidated and whatever. We need a fresh start. So we're going to go to wherever we're going to go and we're going to paint it a different color and we're going to and we do that. And some of us do that very often and some of us do that once in a while. Evolution doesn't work that way. You kind of retain what you start with, the primal, primitive brain, which is all about do I stay or leave? Am I safe or not? And that is a piece of the human brain. It's in the stem of our modern brain. It's real. And some people call it the reptilian brain. Others, primal brain, primitive brain. But this is the beginning. And the beginning is all about survival. And evolution is driven all about can you mate and create another similar creature to keep this game going. And so that's like the basics. You can add on top of that reading Shakespeare, doing math problems and all of those kinds of things. But this is real. So the shark brain is retained but modified in the frog, in turn retained and modified in the crocodile, and then a cat as an example of a simpler mammal, and then the human brain, and then over here the brain of a bird. So, so the avians are sort of tucked into between reptiles and mammals. So it's important to realize that my behavior, something could happen around me and I slip into my primal brain functions. I'm anxious, I'm scared, I'm frightened. Do I stay or leave? Leave means run. Stay means kick back and chill. Sometimes involuntary, and this is deeply seated in my subconscious. So it even can kick in a dream when we're recalling stories, certain kinds of scenarios. So it's very important to appreciate evolution is an incremental, increasing change about a selective advantage in the environment. And so in every era, mammals begin 550. That shark up there, the ancestor, is 550 million years ago. So it's not something any of us, I believe, in the room can remember. It's a long time ago. But over this time, many things within that animal, but more important, around that animal, really shaped evolution. And you can make diagrams and look at pictures like this, and underneath the pictures are things called genes. And if the genes mutate, and then mutate, and then mutate, things change, because the blueprint is found in... And that sound is from 550 million years ago. So we are coming along at 150,000 years ago. So over the 150,000 years, there continues to be some evolutions, but if we were to bump into somebody who was a Homo sapien from 150,000 years ago, they would be a little bit smaller than we are, but they would look very much like we do. And then going in the other area, when we now have this capacity to look at human DNA, we're finding percentages in DNA of Neanderthal. So I'm walking here, I'm standing here, I'm 2% Neanderthal. Some of you are 1.5%, maybe 1.75%, but we all have a trace, a signature of the genetic sequence that says Neanderthal, not Homo sapien. And that is now dogma. It's been, the findings have been replicated in many parts of the world. China is very active in molecular genetics, and Europe, and some parts of the Middle East, especially Israel, etc. So the other thing is, every once in a while, genes, like 3.5 million years ago, 3 genes that could be identified, connected with human beings, controlled nerve regeneration. Those have been modified. But for some of us, my training was in the field of developmental biology. If you cut the optic nerve of a goldfish, which is kind of a gross thing to do, but you know, lab animals are used for these kinds of questions, can it regenerate its vision? And lo and behold, no big deal, it does.
Wow.
If you get a salamander and cut off its tail, and all of a sudden it grows back a tail, and you could not tell the difference between the old tail and the new tail. Complete regeneration. In human beings, we have the capacity to regenerate about 1/5 of our livers, which means that we have the ability, depending on diseases and so forth, to accept a transplant from another consenting human being who can match us in terms of our so-called histocompatibility complex, and surgery can take a good piece from someone, because it's going to regenerate, and put it into a person who has an extensive liver degeneration and keep them alive and so forth. Yes, please.
So what's your opinion of the Chinese using CRISPR to design human forms?
Well, the Chinese government has formally announced through its investigations that it is censoring this individual, and that it is going to try to conform with the ethics of the world. A lot of people have raised the issue that we don't know enough downstream in humans. We have a lot of experience now with plants. CRISPR is used in plants, and CRISPRs are used in making mouse genetically defined strains, etc. And so we're gaining a lot of information, but the current sort of laws of engagement say don't go there.
But I understood that its twin girls are already born.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, it's like, you know, the United States is 320 million people. And every once in a while, somebody walks into a bar where people are dancing and having a good time in Thousand Oaks, California, and shoots 17 people. It kind of goes with the theory, if you give enough people in a country, we're the 3rd largest country in the world. China is #1, India is #2, we're #3. You know, in the vernacular, shit will happen because the scale of the population is so enormous. Ambition trumped prudence, ambition, notoriety trumped ethical concerns, and it goes on. Not only, I mean, this one went all over the world very quickly, and committees were assembled and people have looked at it, but stuff like this does happen. When in vitro fertilization first came around, which is now a routine procedure in OBGYN and so forth, but when it first came around, I mean, the first reaction was, this is like producing monsters, and so it really took, it could be done in animals easily, and that was proof of principle. It went through clinical trials, it went through different kinds of things, and then finally to human beings, and it doesn't produce, you know, monsters, and you don't get cancer and that kind of stuff. But you must, as a civilized human being, raise the questions in a very clear way and look for lines of evidence that support clinical efficacy or not. And if the answer is or not, you put it on the shelf and you don't use it on people.
Well, do you think that it would ever be possible to have some global understanding or reasonable agreement to say that this is an area that always should be tabled when it comes to human beings?
Yeah, I mean, people, I have a pony who lives inside of me, and sort of a kind of an optimistic perspective of things. Eleanor Roosevelt articulated the idea of a unity of nations that would eventually lead to one nation, which would lead to core values being shared and ethics and all of those sorts of things, way back just about the time her husband died in 1945. So it's not, and Woodrow Wilson and the idea of the League of Nations entertained this idea. But when you look at the world today, a lot of work is going to have to be done. A glimmer of hope is the climate agreement, so-called Paris Agreement, where the majority of nations, including our own at the time, signed up and said, the planet is endangered and we really need to change human behavior and choices and readjust economics in order to survive well into the future. Many countries signed up and made commitments, and by 2030 we will do this, and by 20 so forth. And that's going in that direction, but it's very imperfect. And obviously our country, under its current leadership, decided to pull out. It's still, if you live in the state of California, Jerry Brown and the folks that were around him were able to put in initiatives and goals, and the state is attempting to do it. But the problem is a global problem, not just the state of California.
Right.
So a lot of work has to be done. But I'm optimistic that, I mean, maybe it'll take some dramatic, you know, like Venice will disappear, Miami will disappear, and then people will say, my God, there's something to this.
Do you want to take a little break?
Okay, sure.
We're going to take a 10-minute break. Go ahead and get some coffee, and we'll reassemble.
And this light shines right on the screen,
Yeah.
so it's a glare. Oh. And it's kind of, see the sign says only the,
I don't know if I can change that. I could turn it.
well, I guess we can dim them when everybody's got
So that
it.
is-
Yeah, let's do it when people, no, leave them on now because people are going to be up.
My email, I wasn't here last week, but I said,
Ten-minute break.
still in touch with the emails.
Anyone who didn't get on the email list last time to get stuff through the mail, I'm going to pass this around. Sure. Okay, yeah.
But if you have more assignment in your, and you turn on for Orange Road and continue. So there's.
Oh, that's the best thing I was in your district.
Sorry, I didn't. I grew up in North Side. I love North Side. There were two, at least, support you, and this person.
The little starts and stops and so forth. Nothing really done this hard.
Yes, yes, and there was a Joseph-led, and that group of your people, they were coming into the parking lot, just as I was going into the parking lot, and we didn't know if they knew what I was saying. Where are you here from? I said, I don't know, I saw and now even LA is getting to be much more up Every day, like in a sense of humor, you
Hey, Nancy.
Was this from last week?
Yeah, Thank you. Thanks for coming and joining us. Yeah, okay.
All right, everyone, let's gather around. I want to mention that we have handouts about this topic today at the back. Feel free to pick them up. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You said that from the United States, that such a huge proportion of people have Alzheimer's or dementia. Okay, in other countries, I mean, are we sort of the leaders? In other words, is the proportion of people with dementia in the United States higher than it is, for instance, in
The
Norway
proportion-
or Britain or Africa?
The industrial countries of the world have in common, they're economically doing either okay or very well, and they're all looking at an aging population where the number of people who are 65 and older is larger than the number of people from birth to 21. So when the number of, the proportion of children is reduced and the percentage of people older, defined as 65, is increased, the countries are confronted with a whole set of issues that a emerging so-called third world country would not be dealing with, where they have an enormous number of people under 15 and a much smaller number of people over 65. So from a proportion point of view, all of the industrial countries, Italy, France, Germany, Sweden, the UK, Canada, have the comparable percentage of dementia and Alzheimer's as we do. So that was very important to get to the data of that, because is this an American problem due to something in America, our water, our air, our whatever, or is this part of the aging phenomenon in the industrial countries? Now, an outlier to what I just said is Colombia in South America. Some people discovered, and it's been on 60 Minutes, and it's been written up, they discovered that late adolescent children were becoming demented and in their early 20s expressing Alzheimer's. And there are like hundreds of such people. So obviously, American, Johns Hopkins, and a number of universities have put together teams, gone in, look at the DNA. What's coming out of this, which you would almost intuitively come to the same conclusion, when you say Alzheimer's, it's not one thing. It's like saying cancer. At one point, we only said it was cancer. Then it got, well, it's lung cancer or liver cancer or skin cancer. And then now today it's dropping down much finer because of molecular biology, and it's now looking at what particular pathways are being affected. And now there's a new term called gene drivers. What are the rate-limiting steps in this particular malignancy? They found it in Jimmy Carter, who had a metastatic melanoma, and were able to do the analysis, come up with therapy, and he's alive and well doing his habitat routine in his mid-90s. A few examples that we're aware of, but this is going on in cancer centers all over the United States, where every once in a while they find the issue, they come up with a therapy, and this is called high-definition precision healthcare. And the hope is not just to have it for cancer, but to have it for all of the conditions, and we're going to be exploring that. Anyone else have? Okay. So this is embryonic development, the hearing and smelling and vision and tasting and all of those aspects going on in embryonic development. And here is looking at time and the development of the brain, starting with the neural tube at 25 days, and then the primitive brain forms, and then on top of it is a hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain by 40 days, and then pretty large frontal process in 50 days, and then the really sophisticated stuff by 100 days, and then by 9 months there's a brain. But we also know that by 9 months that brain is going to continue to go through some episodes that we call postnatal. So this would be in the embryo or fetus, and then it goes on to something a little bit more. Here's a reminder: 3 pounds, 80% water, 86 billion neurons, 86 billion glial cells, trillions of synapses, and we respond to sensory responses. What is interesting is we are born with the same number of cells that we're going to have when we die.
In our brain.
In our brains. And so many of us, when we were schooled, were taught differently, that what life is all about is the progressive loss of neurons. It's not true. Number of cells is the same that we start with and we finish with. So we are born with all the brain cells we will ever get, question, or we die with the same number of neurons that we had as a child. Correct answer.
Yes.
That didn't hurt, did it? So here are some points that I've extracted from the book by David Engelman that is really worth remembering. And it starts obviously with the cognitive part of your brain being used to accept yourself. So in our country, many young girls are challenged with, you don't look like the pictures in the magazine, and it leads to often a loss of self-esteem. Or we have what are called helicopter parents. I'll fill out the applications, I'll get you into college, I'll even do your homework kind of stuff, and never let go. And that doesn't necessarily produce the best and the brightest. It often produces codependency, and sometimes kids not getting the amount of self-esteem that you often get by building it yourself, learning it yourself, doing it yourself. And so whether you're male or female, self-esteem is a very, very real phenomenon.
Excuse me.
Yes?
On the last one with preventing neurodegenerative diseases, that's not always possible because sometimes something medical comes in and you could be learning, and you still could be getting one of those, which I have, so I know that that's possible.
Sure. Yeah. These are not cause and effect arguments. These are generalities
Oh, okay.
that there are people who do not read, do not venture into unfamiliar territory, and so forth. And basically, learning implies that you're trying. You might not succeed. You're trying to exercise. It's almost like a form of aerobic exercise. Learning causes your brain to learn new things, which means the cell number stays the same as when you were a child. The synapses change. And it's a story of in the neurosciences, they use a word which I find, it's kind of one of those attractive words. I thought that pruning was limited to, in the garden, you prune plants. I didn't realize that there is something called neuropruning, in which in a newborn infant, when they get to be 2 years of age, almost all of the synapses are broken down, removed, and replaced from new stimuli. And I didn't know that adults had the capacity to learn new things, get rid of some old things. And so it kind of speaks to when talk therapy works, when good friends and engagements work, but they're never 100%. They're never, for sure. But learning is another way of saying I'm exercising my central nervous system.
And I can
Or I'm
slow
trying to.
down some of the medical things.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and there's also, the opposite, use it or lose it. If you stop being stimulated by your own choice for some reason, I'm going to stay home. I don't want to go out. I don't want to be around people anymore, and on and on and on. Then it's the kind of use it or lose it phenomenon. The idea of staying engaged, as hard as it might be as we get older, is really a phenomenal insight into what the brain is and how the brain functions. And then I think for a moment, the food choices are very important. Staying hydrated, meaning the brain cannot become dehydrated and it needs 20% of your diet. So the idea of, especially for me personally, I went decades with no breakfast. I can't be bothered. A cup of coffee and I'm at work, as opposed to a real breakfast. Well, if you really want to treat your brain, and this is as a professor, if you really want to treat your brain optimally, then you need to pay attention to your physical exercise and your mental exercise. And then some of the food choices that go with that. So the brain, from a housekeeping point of view, is about 85% subconscious. That's taking care of all of the biological functions that you don't pay attention to. The microbiota in your gut, you're absorbing and utilizing nutrients. Your detoxing going on in your liver when you have certain lipophilic substances coming into your body, and on and on and on. The conscious part is the part that we have. So some reading for some of you who might be interested. David Sousa, How the Brain Learns. Ed Schneider's book on Ageless. David Egerman's book, The Brain. There's also a 6-part PBS special from his book that's available on YouTube. If you have internet connection, YouTube is a good choice. And so you might type in The Brain or David Eggleman, and it's free. And then a book called Daniel Levitin on Your Brain and Music. There was a time when pregnant moms were told that if you would play Mozart or Bach during your pregnancy, your baby is going to be smarter. And that was initially, I mean, certain people just jumped to it, and they sold a lot of records and recordings and stuff. Other people poo-pooed it, and the research that's been done is mixed. There's an argument for it and an argument against it, but the idea of erring on the side of filling your home with classical music, it's not a bad idea. It can't hurt you. So, any one of us stripping away all of the stuff that's in the way, our brain, our spinal cord, our peripheral nerve, and that's the infrastructure of neurology. And obviously, things that happen over here at your fingertip, where you accidentally cut yourself on a piece of paper or some such thing, go through this elaborate process of getting up to your brain, and out comes ouch, or I'm concerned, or I better get a bandage, or I'm going to apply pressure, or some such thing. So this area allows this elaborate organism called Homo sapien to read the environment, be stimulated by various things, take it in, process it, either ignore it or deal with it, and that's this sort of the schema here. Looking at it a little closer, these are the variety of nerves and types of nerves that are engaged in feeding in information, reading the environment. All of it is about staying safe and being able to reproduce. After you get beyond reproduction, which applies to probably most of us in the room, who knows what this is all about. Then looking closer at a spinal, the input and output, there's this elaborate communication where the stimuli translated into a nerve impulse is propagated up a nerve and then to a higher level and a higher level and a higher level, and then a decision is made, and the time it takes to do that is measured in milliseconds or nanoseconds, meaning really short period of time. The neurons obviously have lots of details, but it's a cell like any other cell in the body on one sense, and in another sense it has this unbelievable ability of forming synapses. The average neuron in your heads has 10 to 100 synaptic connections. So it's sort of like ultimate, like multitasking. It'll take in some sound, it'll take in some music, it'll take in something about food, it'll smell, whatever. It is unbelievable the diversity of interpretation that goes on in a neuron, 86 billion of them, and then further aligned with one another through connections that process this world of sensory input. The collective we call thinking, reflecting, hoping, dreaming, loving, caring, so forth. All of those wonderful attributes. They come in different sizes and shapes, but as you can see, especially on the right screen over here, it looks like a shaky hand is drawing them. It is amazing the architecture of these cells and their functions. Then, if you have the ability, which today science has, you can now image the brain in 3 dimensions. So with new MRI technology and the resolution being improved, you can visually look at all of the brain or parts of the brain in 3 dimensions. And then you can add a 4th dimension, time. So you can volunteer for a clinical trial, you can go into an MRI little tube, and you can get imaged in 3 dimensions, and somebody can be talking to you, and you can respond and be engaged in a discussion. And what the visual imaging can do is see where are these signals jumping around and going to, and be able to discover new circuits, new interpretations, those kinds of things. Then we know that the brain makes hormones and it makes neurotransmitters. So when you go to the gym and you exercise and you come out feeling self-righteous, or you run a marathon or something short of a marathon, and you really, kind of get puffed up, your brain has decided to put out a lot of dopamine. It puts out enkephalons and encephalons, and it gives you a chemical sense of well-being. That's the way the brain treats you. On the other hand, you're feeling lonely, you're feeling deserted, you're feeling cheated, you're feeling betrayed, and the brain does a different kind of chemistry that feeds into what we clinically would call depression. And in a person with bipolar disorder, there is a different chemistry than in schizophrenia, and a different one in just garden variety depression that many of us go in and out of in the course of just being alive. It's hard to avoid depression 100%, but we overcome it by, we're going to go to the gym or go on the treadmill or do something, or we're going to cook something we haven't done, or someone in my life loves to bake every once in a while and goes on a baking binge of sorts. So all of that kind of stuff. And of course, if we live in circumstances of being deprived, if we live in famine, the brain is a consequence. So during World War II, certain parts of Europe, during the fighting of, say, 42, 43, 44, in that window, certain parts of Europe were cut off, famine kicked in, a lot of people developed the consequences of famine. And here's an example of what dopamine looks like. But in order to make dopamine, you need the ingredients, and you get the ingredients from food. So if you don't have the food source, then your neurochemistry can be compromised because you don't have the building blocks to put together the molecules that we give names like serotonin and dopamine and so forth. Please.
I've noticed my mom's 93 and I'll go and visit her. She's in Florida and she'll eat poorly. I'll feed her for a week and a half, and cognitive issues go away. She's up, she's happy. Then I go away, don't feed her again, she goes right back to where she was. So food really does fuel the brain. I can't say enough about it.
Mm-hmm.
It also cleans out the garbage that collects, right?
I don't know.
That's what I've been hearing about as well.
It's also the intellectual stimulation of you conversing with her for that week. That makes a big difference.
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah. Very good point.
I just read a percentage that said 80% of our health is the result of our diet.
That's wonderful.
I don't know that, I don't know that I absolutely believe that number and how reliable.
And the Wall Street Journal is reporting completely different, that exercise and activity level eclipses diet beyond everything else.
That's my learning has been analogous. That it isn't about we often in our language use or as opposed to and. But if we use and, exercise, engagement with other people, all of those activities, plus diet, plus water, and so forth, optimizes the human condition at whatever age we happen to be. To write one of those off means to compromise something. Yes, please.
What about cultural influence? Because
Yeah,
some
sure.
cultures that respect aging, the people do age much longer and much better. But then in this culture where you're a Grey Panther or you're, like a father, it's a completely different mindset.
Yeah. I was saying, social inclusive of culture, but absolutely, good point. Thank you.
So can I just ask about inflammation then, like the food choices, the exercise, the socialization, all those help to decrease the inflammation. Are you going to address anything related to inflammation?
A little bit. The inflammatory cells of the brain are the glial cells. And there are the same number of glial cells as there are neurons, 86 billion. And those cells and the diet that feeds those cells and the biology of those cells help to reduce or nearly eliminate inflammation within the organ called the brain. So many people historically thought the brain was off limits to any kind of inflammation. That isn't true. And instead of antibodies, T cells and B cells and so forth, glial cells are the inflammatory cells of the central nervous system. So moving right along, here's an example. And if you think of it, you go out to dinner and you're in some restaurant you've never been to before, and you sit down and you serve, and you're experiencing sort of wonderful odors that are amazing to you. And the idea that something in the air, which is the odor, is picked up by the ends of these cells, these gustatory cells, these taste buds, and then goes to the central nervous system, and then goes through some particular circuit, and then indicates that that this is really, you're having a good time. This is really special. And maybe you even start making some neurotransmitters that go along with this very special evening that you have, and maybe it's even added by somebody special is sitting at the table with you. Very interesting phenomenon, taste receptor. So the brain, at one level, before it got to the point it is today, these areas were learned about through clinical accidents. You're in an automobile accident and your brain is cut in half. So what does the left side do? What does the right side do? Or you become spontaneously blind. And what about the vision? Or you can't smell anymore. And what's that all about? Anyway, through that process, these physical locations have been identified by ablation, often in a cat or dog laboratory animal, to put together a map at the time of the central nervous system. And this was considered a really big deal to do. Today, which is just mind-boggling to me, the new maps that are being made are cell by cell by cell. Single cell analysis, three-dimensional mapping, looking at the function of individual cells, and as you might imagine, surprises coming out. Meaning, instead of these geographic locations that would appear to be fixed, they're not fixed. If you watch a nerve impulse go in, let's say something we're looking at, and it goes into your brain, it's bouncing around sort of like a video game or something. It's touching many, many, many different areas. And so that fixation. This is looking at some really beautiful pictures that were taken at UC Irvine of three-dimensional images of neurons and how they are sending out their extensions and making synapses. Really quite beautiful. And we have, of course, trillions of these. And then over here, a gene called FOXP2 is responsible for language. The family came along in England. No one spoke. They were silent. And an analysis was done. There's a gene mutation in a gene called FOXP2, and all of a sudden people around the world said, gee, that must have something to do with communication, to do with learning, to do with speaking, to do with so forth. And so instead of limiting the gene to speech only, it really became a gene of communication. Another one came along, these names, I didn't dream any of these up, SRGAP2, which increases connectivity between cells. So if you degrade a synapse, this gene is turned on and a new synapse is created. And then Notch2NL is a gene that regulates the increased number of neurons. So if anything comes along and you have a depletion of neurons, you have the capacity to regenerate not exactly what was there before, but in a sense, new stem cells that become neurons that become teachable by stimuli to fill in a place in your brain. Really quite remarkable. So keep in mind, all of this discussion is about atoms. Carbon, phosphorus, hydrogen, sulfur, these different kinds of molecules, atoms. You put these atoms uniquely together, they make a molecule. You put the molecules together and under a rare set of circumstances which are considered almost unpredictable, they form a living creature. And that was a 3.5 billion year event. But after all is said and done, we and our central nervous system is made out of atoms. They're put together in a three-dimensional pattern. They end up being, we call them organelles or cells or tissues or organs, but it is at that level. And the nerve impulse is a reminder of the atoms that produce this physical impulse that propagates through the brain, that after on a higher level, we say, I'm really having a good time. I really love this person. I'm really sad and I have a loss. I mean, but it's at the atomic level is where we really live, but we tend to pretend it's at a much higher level, and we pretend that everything we know is the truth, and we pretend that if we take a course at UCLA or Caltech or USC or wherever it is, we are immunized for the rest of our life in that field. And the idea that knowledge keeps changing, information keeps changing. The internet and Wikipedia, I don't know how many people are somewhere in the world keep updating the Wikipedia, because it's really refreshing. When you see 2018 is the entry, I mean, that's pretty impressive, as opposed to 2002 is the entry, and so forth. So you've got the feeling, and we're at that point, and how about some questions? Please.
Okay, is there any correlation between the size of the brain and the specificity of the brain? In other words, we as
No.
humans, because I was trying to understand what's going on between the ears of an elephant as opposed to a whale shark, and are they as, the connectivity of those neurons and synapses as detailed as ours?
No. Your question raises an issue that I thought was fascinating. A group of people wanted, they've taken Albert Einstein's brain,
Yeah,
and they put it in a formaldehyde bottle,
yeah.
and folks wanted to see, is there anything that you can visualize that is unique about him? And there's a part of the brain where hand and digit coordination goes to, and he had an enlargement on one hand of a certain finger. And it turns out that was connected to his lifelong involvement with playing the violin.
Wow. And that's
But
a
nothing
certain
to
sector of the
do
brain.
with, nothing to do, well, I mean, that, being able to play music and read music and listen to music, and so it's part, and all of the stimulation, little kids who are handed violins when they're 2 years old, it will make a difference. Whether you interpret the difference in some usable fashion is very subjective, but language, the ability to learn new languages, to learn music, so many things it's like wide open when you're 2 and 3 and 4 years of age, and then it kind of starts settling in a little bit. And for some of us, I might want to play the piano more than anything in the world right now, and I could probably get to the point of doing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but I'm not going to get, in Carnegie Hall at this point. But it is amazing the ability of the young forming brain to be able to take in this information. Now, one thing before we wrap up, the human brain stops developing when we're 25, not 18, not 50. So when your grandchildren confront you, I know what I'm doing, with some degree of assertiveness. Smile, understand, but it's not over. And the last part of the brain to form is the executive decision-making part in the cerebral cortex. That segment is the last. So when you think of driver's license, or going into the military, or going to college, or binging on liquor, and say that's part of the college experience, and on, those behaviors, those choices. They're the choices of an 18-year-old brain, or a 19, or a 20, or a 21, but they are not necessarily the kind of prudent approach that some of us might have towards those decisions. And it's something you have to deal with. It's also in this room, you will recall that your childhood lasted shorter than your grandchildren's childhood. It's getting longer. Sometimes it lasts into your 40 or 50 at the moment. It's really is fascinating. Kids go to college and sometimes things are not working out and so forth, and they're coming home and like, where's my room? My room is supposed to be a shrine. What did you do? You remodeled my room? Are you kidding? That's a sacred place. It's kind of, I mean, you have to grin, but it's that yearning for, that was my place. That's where I grew up for certain kinds of people. So I hope you enjoyed it. We'll leave the brain alone and move on. But I thought some of this would be very useful when you think of science informing behavior. And for those of you interested, there's a free webcast that is going to be coming from London on January 17th of this year. It's sponsored by the National Academy of Medicine, that's USA, and the equivalent National Academy of Science in Great Britain. The title is Behavioral Change to Improve Health for All. And it goes from the science and the recommendations from the science to choice, to behavior.
Would you email that to the group? Would you
Um,
email the details?
Sure,
Thank you.
sure, we could do that.
No.
Somebody could scan it.
It's an 8-hour webcast.
How do you Google it?
Pardon me?
How do you Google it?
Just Google behavior change to improve health, and then National Academy of Medicine.
Anything else? Please.
On your recommended reading list, I wanted to check if you had an opinion of a man named Ray Kurzweil, who's
No, of
Google's
course.
chief scientist. And
Unbelievable. He has a book called The Creation of the Human Mind.
because he's pretty far out there, but
Yeah, he is far out there, but he's real. He's authentic. He's put together, it's going on now. He has an international team of scientists and engineers and mathematicians and so forth. And his belief is, with the right tools, I can replicate the mind. And this is no small undertaking. I think he has a patent. He was one of the original people on speech recognition.
optical character recognition.
Yeah, and so he has that particular background, but apparently just open, he sort of reminds me of the guy behind Tesla.
Bill Gates said he's the smartest computer scientist, maybe the smartest scientist in the world.
Really?
And Kurzweil claims that health is an information science, because we're DNA based, and therefore the laws where computers doubled in power and we learned more and more and it got amazing, that health will respond the same way. The more we learn about our DNA, we'll make breakthroughs that will boggle your mind.
Yeah.
Become like your cell phone instead of a
Yeah.
computer.
And you know, there's a number of people, I mean, it's one of these things where the data, I mean, we don't know yet the outcome. But there are a lot of people who believe that if you take some of the things we're referring to, modern biology, and you connect it with machine learning, and you connect it with artificial intelligence, and you throw in CRISPR, that this is the first time in human evolution that humans, in theory, have the capability of designing their future.
Wow.
So instead of evolution being a random mutation, that it could be, so there's a book out that I picked up, I think we talked about it a little bit, it's called Life 3.0. So Life 1 is bacteria, origins of life, the beginning of biology, so to speak. Life 2.0 is where we are at the moment, our biology, reproduction, aging, all of the stuff that we're all aware of. And life 3.0 has not yet happened. And it is the sort of the tomorrow. So if you follow this field, either formally or informally, China and the United States are basically going head-to-head in moving artificial intelligence, moving genomics, moving these technologies forward. It's fascinating. And some of us are not going to live long enough to see the life 3.0. But just to read about the possibilities is extraordinary.
Who's
And
the
thank you
author?
for, pardon me?
Who's the author?
You know, I'm not remembering. If I remember it, I'll send it out on an email to you and have that. The other thing, before we break up, some handouts.
Max,
Yes.
it's Max Tadmark.
Oh, yes. Max Tadmark.
Tadmark.
T-A-D?
T-A-G-M-A-R-K.
T-A-G-M-A-R-K. It's a paperback. Wonderful, wonderful read. He's also one of these superstars in information technology and so forth. Now, this is a handout which I think is a redundant of something that's in the back, but it has on it 6 questions for you to take a look at. I'll read you the, let's see if we can hand this out.
No, I don't think this.
The questions are, so they're found in one page. What I've done is I've put down the internet address that go with each question.
Okay.
So either you know the answer straight away, or you could look it up, so to speak. The first question is, what is precision medicine? Second, what is the difference between precision medicine and personalized medicine? What about pharmacogenomics? Third, what is precision medicine initiative? Next, what are some potential benefits of precision medicine and the precision medicine initiative? And then the last, what are the challenges? And there's an address to go with each of them. Then there is one-page double, which is all of us, the email connection and a little bit about the background of it. And then a paper by yours truly that's sort of like big picture overview of what we've been talking about, which really we spent last week really delving into a bit, and a couple of you were not with us, and this is an opportunity to sort of get up to speed with that. And I hope you have a nice week, and thank you very much.